G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at my team selection for the Dutch Grand Prix. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back into F1 Fantasy. We are just under 2 weeks out from the next Grand Prix on the F1 calendar for 2024. We had a few weeks to disconnect after the Belgian Grand Prix concluded, and feeling very refreshed and energized heading into the second half of the season. I myself needed the break, to be completely honest. I've been very inactive on Twitter for those of you that follow me on there recently, and I've just needed the time to take a break from F1, really enjoy the warm weather in the summer, and come back feeling charged up and excited for the back half of the year. I think we've had an extremely exciting start to F1 though this year. The battle for the drivers and the constructors is very much open, certainly in the constructors because of Sergio Perez's woes for Red Bull. Do we see him stay in the seat for the rest of the season, let alone into 2025 and beyond? I don't know yet. But I think it has made for not just an enthralling F1 viewing this year, but also the most diverse and varied F1 fantasy season that I can remember. This is my fourth season of playing the game, my third playing it seriously, and maybe my rank on screen doesn't look like I do, but that's, a product of just bad luck, which F1 fantasy has in spades. So yeah, coming off the back of a Belgian Grand Prix, if you saw my reaction to George Russell's disqualification on Twitter, you probably know how I feel about the result. It was, when he crossed the line, probably could have been or would have been my best non-chip weekend of the season. And I was super pumped about it. I was happy with the decisions going into the deadline. And notwithstanding that, very happy with how the team set up heading into the Netherlands. But it was a pretty crippling result for me. The minus 25 to Mercedes constructor and George Russell was diabolical, to say the least, after having the win sewn up, positions gained, overtakes, all that good stuff. And then to, I think, what looked like close to a top 5,000 after being around the 8.5s to now a 9.7k overall rank. And I think it was about 50 to 75 points in terms of what it could have been to what it was. Very much not the outcome I would have liked, but that's in the past. I've had a couple of weeks to reflect, put it to the back of my mind. As I said, fantasy can be very luck-based at times, and I'm accepting of that, but it is obviously a bit of a kick in the guts regardless. Mercedes aside, a pretty good weekend across the board. Oscar Piastri, I had eyes on 2xing, and with George obviously stepping down from the win, Oscar assumed P2, 30 points. He is, in my opinion, one of the drivers in form at this point of the season, in a great car and fantasy-wise, exceptional value for money at 23.6 million. And then the C-tier drivers doing their part. Probably expected a few more points from Tsunoda starting at the very back, but that V-carb just didn't seem to be suited to Spa quite as much as maybe it has been on other tracks this season. Can't really expect much more from Logan Sargent. Quite frankly, if it's not a DNF, it's a win. And then Hulk, I know we've seen splashes of really good F1 fantasy form, but I think the driver of his caliber just isn't necessarily quite a good fantasy asset compared to what he might be ordinarily in the real world. Like the Haas itself, I do think a great car, exceptionally good race pace, an experienced driver, and he has been carrying that team this year, but I just don't know if he's quite what we'd expect from him as an F1 fantasy asset. But he is consistent. He gets the car into good positions to score points. So if he can convert good results from qualifying into good results in the race, that's really as much as you can ask for a C-tier asset under 10 million. So 141 points for the weekend, a rank drop of about 1.8. No, it was about 1.6 million. 1.6k. 1.6 million would be diabolical. And, as I said, the team set up nicely for the Dutch Grand Prix. Just need a little bit of luck at times in the second half of the calendar to push for that top 5, top 3k overall. So I mentioned a driver that I've got my eye on based on his recent form. And typically this driver spotlight / watch list, whatever you want to call it, usually pertains to the following race. But Oscar Piastri for me is a driver I insist looking into for not just the next race, but for as long as he is a B tier asset. I do think at 23.6 million, moving into the A tier, the $25 million plus threshold. It's only a matter of when, not if, for 2024. And the reason I say that is because we've seen Lando, we've seen McLaren, and move into the A tier at various points this season. And I do think that's bound to happen for Oscar as well. He's on a mean streak of results, and I don't expect that's going to change anytime soon, particularly because he has just been putting himself in positions to capitalize on opportunities when presented to him. And his scores in the last 4 races of 42, 23, 46, and 30 have necessarily not just been because he's been the beneficiary of bad results for others, but he is making the most of, as I said, those opportunities on track when they become available. So that P2 in Austria because of Max and Lando's collision, that win in Hungary, although there was a bit of team theatrics and such, still gave himself every opportunity to win. And then again in Belgium, 30 points there. Was on the podium anyway, but obviously with Russell's disqualification meant he was promoted to P2. So he is the driver in form over the last 4 race weekends. The only driver I would say that would perhaps outstrip him would be Lewis Hamilton. But I'm really liking the fact that Oscar's still got some room to grow in the B tier for price gain. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see another $1 million increase at a low overtake track like Zandvoort coming up. The other thing I will say, at 20% ownership, I'd say a lot of that ownership is from those engaged managers inside the top 10K, the top 50K that have been tracking McLaren quite closely or do have them in their team. I do expect that's going to increase as he gets closer and closer to 25, and I do suspect that may actually drop once he hits the $25 million threshold, just because the likes of Lando Norris are already there and probably a more reliable and consistent 2X option than maybe Piastri is at the moment. But that could change. It's just funny how the narrative can swap on a dime in F1 Fantasy. But I do think he's got all the makings of a superstar F1 Fantasy driver. His production is right there. His value is right there. I don't think that's going to change for the rest of the season. So he is on my second half of the season watch list. He's already in my team, and I just can't see myself moving off him unless there's any unexpected turns with the McLaren or with him in particular over the next few races. That suspects there is cause for concern there. In terms of some considerations for team selection heading into Zandvoort, I think the one thing that does stand out to me is the history of overtakes at this track. Now, in 2021 and 2022, both years had overtakes of less than 25. We saw 2023 being an exceptional outlier. We had 240 overtakes in that Grand Prix in Zandvoort. And a large part of that, if not all of that, was mostly attributed to the inclement weather we saw there in the Grand Prix. I'm going to bring up the 2023 fantasy results. Every driver had double-digit scores, except for those that either were not classified or, in George Russell's case, lost, more than 10 or so positions, which I think was quite telling. We never ever see those races unless there is bad weather that promotes those overtakes. I don't know if we're going to see anything like that again. Fernando Alonso, that driver of the day, 62 points, even though Max did win the race. But, you look at the likes of Gasly, 39 points, Ocon, 26 points, Ricciardo, 19, Albon, 17, Tsunoda, Magnussen, Bottas, Hülkenberg, Stroll, all double-digit point scorers. We just never see that many from C-tier assets all in the same weekend. So it is something to think about, that the weather was a huge factor in last year's huge point scoring outcome for F1 Fantasy. There is rain in the forecast, although we are just under 2 weeks out at the time of recording from the Zandvoort Grand Prix. There is some rain in the forecast on the Sunday, but I fully expect that forecast is going to change the closer we get to the deadline. And I think we'll cover a bit more of that in my final thoughts video, but I do suspect if there is a bit of rain, we could see some teams, some drivers rack up overtakes like we saw with the Haas boys in Canada this year. So keep that in mind. But the fact that it is typically in the 2 years preceding last year, under 25 overtakes per race, 1 overtake per driver, I think that's going to work in favor of the 2 premium driver lineup, which we've seen recently at Budapest, at Monaco. So perhaps running a Russell Piastri or a Piastri Hamilton or a Norris Russell, some combination of that could actually do well, because you're going to get more points from those drivers that finish closer to or inside the top 5. And those drivers that typically rely on overtakes, like the Haas guys, the V-carbs, or maybe not the stakes, but the Haas, the RB, for example, are going to be perhaps to their detriment, not able to eat up as many overtakes as they ordinarily would. Now, the other point I've got here on screen are drivers on the chopping block. Probably less of a critical concern for our F1 fantasy teams, but Perez and Sargent are two names I see cropping up from time to time as drivers that may not have a seat on the grid before the year is out. Perez in particular, heavily scrutinized heading into Belgium and that Monday after the Belgian Grand Prix concluded, that he wouldn't have a seat for the remainder of the year. Red Bull have obviously retained him since then. But there is still some news, some rumors, etc. I'm not going to buy into or believe everything I read on Twitter. But some people are saying that he may not have a seat beyond the rest of the year. If you think he will, let me know down in the comments below. But I do think Perez's form is a particular cause for concern, especially because McLaren are closing in on Red Bull in the constructors. Do we see Red Bull pull trigger on Sergio Perez's seat, vacate him, bring in a Liam Lawson or something, and just make hay of an opportunity to try and at least salvage the constructors, even though the drivers I think is wrapped up? Maybe, possibly. If we see someone like Lawson or Ricciardo or Tsunoda take that Red Bull seat before the season is out, I expect they'll come in somewhere between 15 and 20 million. And I think that's a discussion for another time in more detail should the situation arise. But I do suspect there could be some value there if we see a new Red Bull asset in F1 Fantasy. As for Logan Sargent, again, a lot of noise around whether or not Andrea Kimi Antonelli will be dropped into that Williams seat before the end of the season to kind of give him a bit of a transition and opportunity to get warmed up to an F1 car before he ultimately joins Mercedes next season. At least that's what all the news is saying, that he'll be announced at Monza as the second Mercedes driver. So it is a possibility. Terry from F1 Coffee Corner does have some thoughts on that. He is of the view that it's a possibility Williams could potentially open the door, that they haven't necessarily given Sargent a blessing that he will finish the entire 2024 season. So keep an eye on that. If we see Antonelli or someone else deputize or drop in that second Williams seat for the remainder of the year, they also could be a bargain. But again, I'll cover that off in more detail in its own video should the need arise to consider one of these replacement drivers for the remainder of the year. So with all those in mind, I do want to have a look at our F1 fantasy teams, or at least my F1 fantasy team. This, as you saw on the screen before, was what I had after Spa. Pretty happy with the setup, if I'm being completely honest. I do have a couple of lineups in mind, and should I go in the direction, which I may well do, of a double premium lineup where there's a bit more budget building, or assured budget building, I could say, Piastri Russell seems like an obvious fit for me. I would want to potentially, or at least use one more trade, because I do think not using a trade is perhaps somewhat passive. There isn't much I could do. One such approach I could take would be bringing in Lewis Hamilton. And we can see here Lewis is at 24.1 million. He's on a streak of price rises. Why don't we bring up the 2024 price changes on F1 Fantasy Tools? Lewis is on an absolute tear. The guy has had $4.7 million net increase over the last 7 races, more than any other driver on the grid. K-Mag's, in a class of his own as well in the C tier, but Lewis is absolutely insane at the moment, F1 fantasy wise. 4 $1 million increases. As far as I'm aware, I don't think any other driver has had more than 3. Charles, 3, but Ferrari have fallen off a cliff lately. It looks like to me, Lewis is a driver, much like Piastri, that we will be running out of time to capitalize on his price increases before he also becomes an A-tier asset. So getting in Lewis for his reliability, for his consistency, definitely appeals to me. If I did bring him in, though, that would have to mean I'm bringing in Valtteri Bottas, Stake, and Logan Sargent. Terrible fantasy choices, if I'm being honest, but they do enable a lineup like this, which I really do like. I do think Lewis has more room to grow. Another 1 million, certainly at least another 0.3 at a low overtake track like Zandvoort could be on the cards. And for right now, McLaren and Mercedes are the flavor of the month in F1 Fantasy. So I could go that route. the other route would be going back to Lando Norris, just because I do believe he is a much stronger qualifier than Oscar Piastri and probably even the Mercedes drivers as well. The concern here is that it requires a -10, which I'm very much against the idea of doing, especially at a track like Zandvoort, where the ability to recoup, if I can speak English properly, recoup that -10 at a low scoring track is probably much lower. But I do like this. A lot of people ran triple McLaren in Spa, did pretty well, obviously avoided the Russell disqualification too. The one concern is obviously these three guys, the Bermuda Triangle of price drops in F1 Fantasy. So I would certainly avoid it if you're trying to budget build, which is why I like Piastri and Russell or Piastri and Hamilton as B tier assets with a lot of price cap growth. And the thing is, if Lewis does go over 25 million, you can just pivot into George Russell. That $0.5 million drop is not something we're going to see every single week. And quite honestly, I do think even though he's had a rotten run of form lately, if we look at George's scores, we'll cover again the Mercedes and McLaren drivers in more detail in my race week preview and final thoughts video. The DNF in the United Kingdom and the disqualification in Belgium is just not going to happen every week. Hungary, another low overtake track. He did very well there. Austria made the most of Max and Lando coming together to secure that win. So I really do think George is maybe probably close to where he deserves to be priced, but I do think he's going to be one of the better B tier drivers once Lewis, once Oscar have exceeded 25 million. So team selection is very much up in the air. As you can tell, I'm very much only decided on the two constructors, probably Piastri and probably Logan Sargent. But to give you an idea of some other combinations, I know some people ran Lando Norris in Belgium. Obviously wasn't quite the outcome they were hoping for, but I think you could also get to something like this, K-Mag. You might have a bit more budget to reach to a stake driver. The only thing I will say is K-Mag is the kind of driver in F1 Fantasy that qualifies much lower than his teammate and then mops up those overtakes on his way through the field. So he's in a blistering run of form with price increases. I believe it's 4 in a row for the Dane. Yep, correct. And another driver, Ricciardo's 5 price increases in the last 6. So he could also be an option in that improved V-carb. You might be able to stretch to a Sauber there. Otherwise, it's probably going for some of those lower price C tier assets like your Alex Albons. You might be able to get to Nico Hülkenberg too. But, we are starting to see a lot of these drivers progressively increase in price. So I think there's quite a few different combinations pairing McLaren and Mercedes drivers and constructors with one another. And your budget, mine's only 119.1, so maybe not as good as some of you guys watching this, but I do think there's quite a bit of flexibility we can use to build this out. I'm going to delve into some team selection combinations in more detail that are not pertinent to just McLaren and Mercedes in my final thoughts video, but I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As always, thank you again for your love and support. I'm so glad we're back into the swing of things for F1 Fantasy because I've been speaking to quite a few of the content creators in the off-season break, and they are very excited for the kind of content they're producing. There's quite a number of recordings that I'm going to be sharing on Twitter that I've done with several other creators over the break. Obviously, the Fantasy Formula that I'm involved in, and then Pop Pan Man, Tom, the OG F1 Fantasy YouTube creator, also got something there with him coming out shortly. So I'll drop all of those links on my Twitter channel if you want to check those out. But as always, guys, thank you so much for dropping by. So good to have you back for the second half of the year for F1 Fantasy. And I'll see you all very soon.